This is Sky News Today, live from Lviv on the 20th day of the war in Ukraine. More deadly Russian strikes. 4 people are killed in a residential area of Kiev, but the capital's mayor insists its residents will stay and fight.
Everyone is angry. I talk to the people. They don't want to leave.
Российский премьер подчеркнул, надо усилить сотрудничество в рамках союзного государства.
Facing 15 years in jail, the editor from Russian state TV who interrupted her channel's broadcast to protest against the war. More than 3 million refugees have now left Ukraine in the 3 weeks since war began. Despite the ongoing bloodshed, positive noises around peace talks, with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy hailing pretty good progress. Meanwhile, the UK sanctions a further 350 Russian individuals and entities, including the former President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. Speculation: the sanctioned billionaire Roman Abramovich is back in Moscow after his private jet lands in the Russian capital. And Boris Johnson angers human rights and green campaigners ahead of a trip to Saudi Arabia. Well, hello, good afternoon, live from Lviv in the west of Ukraine. 20 days into Russia's invasion of this country, residential areas of the capital, Kiev, have again been damaged by heavy overnight shelling. The city's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, says 4 people were killed. We'll be hearing from him in a few minutes' time. The UK has also slapped sanctions on 350 further Russian individuals and institutions who together have a combined worth of more than £100 billion. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has said that peace talks with Russia will continue today despite the bloodshed, and has appealed directly to Russian troops to surrender. Well, just a few blocks away from where we are is the St. Peter and Paul Garrison Church. In the last few hours, the funerals for 4 Ukrainian soldiers have taken place there. They were killed in the Russian attack on the Yavoriv airbase near the Polish border on Sunday. The soldiers have been named as Colonel Ole Sashishin, born in 1966, Major Serhiy Melnik, born in 1983, Major Krylo Vyshinvanyi, who was born in 1986, and the youngest, also a Major, Rostislav Romanchuk, born in 1991, making him just 20 or 21 years old. Well, earlier I spoke to Colonel Anton Miranovich, who told me what a difference the international support is currently making to Ukraine.
We feel very high level of support from the for international support. We're getting financial support, materials, we're getting even international legion that consists from the foreigners from all over the world. It's very, it makes us stronger, because we can feel that we are not alone in this very tough situation for us, and we are stronger together anyways. If it will continue to be like this, we will feel this. If the level of the support and help will increase, I think we will be stronger, and we will do what we are supposed to do. We will defeat this Russian invaders.
Well, let's take you through then the day's developments here in Ukraine. The Polish, Czech and Slovenian prime ministers are travelling to Kiev, where they're expected to present an aid package from the European Union. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are expected to continue a 4th round of talks via video link, which began yesterday. On the ground, the Red Cross says the situation in the besieged city of Mariupol is extreme, and people are essentially being suffocated in the city with no aid. And the International Organization for Migration says more than 3 million people have now fled Ukraine. But let's show you what's been happening then across the country. As we've heard, Russian attacks on the capital, Kiev, are intensifying, with these residential areas of the city itself and a metro station hit this morning. Another attempt to send aid into the besieged city of Mariupol appears to have been unsuccessful. However, the city council says 2,000 private cars have now been able to escape the city. About 300 residents managed to leave yesterday. Well, meanwhile, Russia says the entire Kherson region is now under their control. Forces are believed to be preparing for an advance on Odessa, Ukraine's third city and crucial economic hub. Elsewhere, the runway at Dnipro's airport was destroyed in an overnight attack, the region's governor has said. The city has, until recently, been seen as a safe haven for people escaping the fighting, but was targeted for the first time last week. And in the west, the number of people confirmed killed in a strike on a TV tower in the Rivne region yesterday has risen to 19, according to local authorities. Sky's Ashish Joshi reports now on the day's main developments.
The bombardment began at dawn. This residential neighborhood just outside Kiev, shaken by large explosions. The Russian invasion is inching slowly towards the capital. Moscow says it only has strategic targets in its sights. Not here, though. This is where ordinary Ukrainian families live.
It's very difficult. Yesterday we extinguished one fire, today another. People are dying, and the worst thing is that children are dying. They haven't lived their lives, and they have already seen this. This is the worst.
The same devastation has been visited on other Kiev neighborhoods. Daylight shows the true extent of the destruction caused by overnight Russian strikes.
Around 10 past 4, I was still asleep, and then I heard this loud explosion, so I jumped out of my bed. My first thought was that everything was okay, I'm still alive. My second thought was that my parents were still asleep, so I pushed open my door because it was stuck. I saw that my family was alive. We grabbed our things and tried to go out through the staircase, but everything was in smoke, so we decided to stay in the apartment and wait for the rescuers.
The Ukrainian president remains in the country and remains defiant. 20 days into the Russian invasion, he continues to implore European leaders to intervene and stop the bloodshed. Joining a meeting in London of Nordic and Baltic leaders, he warned the Russian aggression would not stop at his borders.
There has to be prohibition for the Russian Navy to use the naval ports of the world. We have to disconnect the Russian banks from SWIFT completely. We have to acknowledge Russia as a rogue state, and there has to be a trade embargo with Russia. This is something that we need and something you need as well.
Boris Johnson accepts more can and should be done to help Ukraine.
You talk about trying to protect Ukraine from the air, Volodymyr. Who can listen to your appeals without a sense of urgency? And this is a desperate, desperate moment. And I think we must try to do more, particularly to support you in protecting the Ukrainian people from bombardment by artillery and by aviation.
But as these promises of support are made, the onslaught on the ground continues. Some 3 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee the Russian bombardment. Those who have not been able to leave face an increasingly desperate and dangerous future. Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
Well, the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has said that 4 people have been killed in airstrikes on the Ukrainian capital this morning. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford has spoken to him.
We see the result of bombing. Civilian people died. Last morning we was one district of Bologna where people killed. Today another apartments building. We don't know exactly the numbers of people. We have not entrance to every floor, but right now close to 50 people actually evacuate. A lot of them injured. We give the full support to everyone.
How would you describe the spirit of the Ukrainian people and your feeling about this?
The spirit right now, everyone is angry. I talk to the people. They don't want to leave. In this activity, bring much more energy to everyone, and everyone understand. Don't want to leave, want to defend our city. Talk to the people. They is not disappointed. They really upset what Russian soldiers do it with civilians. But everyone, I talk to the people, simple people. Instead to make evacuation to the west of Ukraine, they ask about the weapons and told, we're ready to be in civil defense and defend our houses.
How can they defend themselves against attacks like this, which are very random?
Right now, it's I call to everyone, every civilian, please spend the time, if it's possible, in bunkers.
And what about the grounds for possible war crimes and referring these sort of attacks to the International Criminal Court? Do you think there is a basis for war crimes being committed here?
Yes, of course. It's international criminal case. What Russians do it with civilian people in our country. We have a lot of examples in other cities. Petra, Irpin, Gostomel, almost destroyed. Right now we see they practice exactly the same what happens in Kharkiv, Mariupol. Right now the same scenario we see in our hometown in Kyiv.
You have European leaders coming here today to Kiev to show their support, but is that enough? What else should be happening?
It's never enough. We told the unity of democratic world, unity around Ukraine is very important, because we fighting not just for our city, we fighting right now not just for our country, we fighting all together for our values, our principles.
Vitaly Klitschko talking to Alex Crawford there. Well, here, the UK government has announced 350 new listings under its Russia sanctions regime, which includes the former president and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. The restrictions were announced as the Prime Minister chaired a meeting of Nordic and Baltic leaders in London ahead of a controversial trip to Saudi Arabia later today. Well, our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates is at Lancaster House in central London. On the sanctions first, Sam, there's a lot more names added here and with a huge combined net wealth, this bunch of oligarchs.
That's right. It is a significant moment. The British government have been scrambling to change the rules in the last few days in order to allow essentially a sort of catch-up exercise with the European Union, where we can now sanction the same people that the EU have gone after. Liz Truss will stand up in the Commons later today to outline the full details. But in addition to individuals, there are also luxury items that are being sanctioned today. Russian vodka, one thing highlighted by the government in an attempt really to put the squeeze further. But one of the questions as leaders from Baltic and Scandinavian countries heard alongside Boris Johnson President Zelenskyy pose is what more can they do? And it's not clear just how much there is left in the locker for Western countries when it comes to putting pressure on President Putin by using simply mechanisms like sanctions.
I think that what the world is seeing is the return in Ukraine to the kind of brutality, the kind of absolutely indiscriminate bombing of civilian centres of great cities that we last saw in the European continent 80 years ago. This is quite unbelievable what is happening now in our continent. And we need to make sure that we build the strongest, widest possible coalition to ensure that Vladimir Putin does not succeed, that we wean ourselves off Russian hydrocarbons, and that's what the UK is helping to do.
So that was Boris Johnson making a broader point as we head into a round of global diplomacy that Boris Johnson is going to embark on in the next few days. He'll be heading to Saudi Arabia later today to meet with the Crown Prince. There is also clearly discussions underway in Iran. One of the consequences of that could be the release of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who's been in detention there from 2016. The question that you just heard from Boris Johnson was in the answer that you just heard from Boris Johnson was an answer to the question whether or not it's suddenly become quite a good moment to be a repressive regime, given all of a sudden Britain looks like it needs things from Saudi Arabia and Iran, both countries that in the past we've sought to portray perhaps as a more distant diplomatic ally rather than somebody that we're hugging close.
Sam, thanks very much. Well, let's get more now from the EU on sanctions against Russia and an EU delegation visit to Kiev. Sky's Laura Bundock is in Brussels for us. And Laura, I understand that peace talks have now resumed.
Yep, that's right. They have. They were paused yesterday. All hopes pinning on these peace talks. From the Russian side, certainly a sense of optimism. Definitely a note of caution and a sprinkling of cynicism, I think, when it comes to any outcome yet. But there are high-level virtual talks with both sides taking place. Meanwhile, from the EU's perspective, we have this really significant moment. We have European leaders, the prime ministers of Poland, Slovenia and the Czech Republic, on their way, as I speak, via train to Ukraine, to the capital, Kyiv, where they're due to meet President Zelenskyy and Ukrainian Prime Minister as well. They crossed over at the Polish border at 7 o'clock in the morning, that's UK time. The journey is going to take them hours and hours, but they are there to show their unequivocal support. A delegation from the European Union. A very interesting quote from the Polish Prime Minister on his Facebook page saying, at such breakthrough times for the world, it is our duty to be where history is forged, he said. Now, the three leaders will be there. They will discuss the packages of support that the EU is offering. We've been hearing about this fourth set of sanctions from Brussels now. So this is increasing the existing packages. It's a ramping up of previous measures and new things as well, including a ban on the exports of Russian steel, the import of Russian steel, ban on the export of luxury goods, expensive cars, diamonds, caviar, cigars, you name it, going into Russia. And then also in more individuals targeted, more organisations, the biggest name, certainly that of Roman Abramovich. And of course, and as well as the economic sanctions, there is this huge humanitarian package of support the EU is offering. This open borders policy, no need for a visa for anyone fleeing Ukraine. And then on top of that, you have the military role as well, the EU providing military support to the Ukrainians and their operations on the ground there. But it is a massive moment. You have these three leaders arriving in Ukraine, in the capital, which is under shelling. So the security threat is huge. Seeing for themselves the situation on the ground, it really is a moment of great significance when it comes to the ultimate show of solidarity and support to Ukraine at the moment.
Laura, thanks very much.
Well, let's get more now from the EU on sanctions against Russia. The International Organization for Migration says the number of people who fled Ukraine has now passed some 3 million. So let's get the very latest then from Lisa Holland, who joins us now from Warsaw. And already, Lisa, you've talked about the pressure that the authorities are there on trying to accommodate some of the people. Presumably, as the numbers pour in, it'll only get worse.
Yeah, hi Anna. I mean, these figures just confirming really what you can completely see with your own eyes, certainly here in the Polish capital. I think what's interesting that in some respects, compared to the figures that we were working on, just a few days ago, they're kind of almost, to me, even worse than you might imagine. For example, the last kind of broad estimate was that Poland, where the lion's share of the refugees have come out of the bordering neighbouring countries to Ukraine, the figure that was generally being used was that about 1.5 million people had passed into Poland. Now they're putting that figure at 1.8 million. And I think that what's really interesting in terms of the context of these figures is that people here in the Polish capital were saying, well, look, OK, if you get 1.5 million people, now 1.8 million people passing into Poland, actually, how many are passing through and how how many does Poland have to deal with? Now, a figure that's come out today is that only about 300,000 of those 1.8 million have moved on to other parts of Europe. We're seeing a lot of people trying to get buses and trains, trying to go off to Germany, Estonia, Latvia, all over really. So that leaves you with a phenomenal number of people who are staying here in Poland. And the big thing to sort of take away from all of this is that often when we're covering certainly migration crises, refugee crises that I've covered over recent years, is that people are generally trying to kind of move somewhere else. They want to rebuild their life somewhere else. It's completely different here. People want to almost like sit out the war, women and children, in a place of safety because they have fundamentally reasons to go home, and that is that the men have stayed to fight. So they want to go back to Ukraine. Therefore, they need somewhere to stay in places like Warsaw and the surrounding areas until hopefully all of this is over, and that's putting an enormous amount of pressure on the Polish authorities. Also, people like the volunteers who are stepping up say there is a kind of lack of orchestration from central government. They want that to change, and they say that frankly the EU and other countries are just not donating enough money to help people on the ground here.
When all of this is over, that is the great unknown, though, isn't it? Lisa, thank you very much indeed. Well, Russian state media say an internal investigation is underway after an anti-war protester interrupted a news program with a sign criticising the war in Ukraine. Marina Ovsyannikova held up a poster saying, "Stop the war, don't believe propaganda, they are lying to you here." And she shouted, "Stop the war, no war," before the program cut away. Well, the protester is an employee of Russia's Channel 1. Before carrying out her protest, she recorded this message.
То, что сейчас происходит на Украине, это преступление. И Россия – страна-агрессор. И ответственность за эту агрессию лежит на совести только одного человека. И этот человек – Владимир Путин. Мой отец украинец, моя мать русская. И они никогда не были врагами. И это ожерелье на моей шее как символ того, что Россия должна немедленно остановить братоубийственную войну. И наши братские народы еще смогут примириться. К сожалению, последние годы я работала на Первом канале, занимаясь кремлевской пропагандой. И мне сейчас очень стыдно за это. Стыдно за то, что позволяла говорить ложь с экрана телевизора. Стыдно за то, что позволяла зомбировать русских людей. Мы промолчали в 2014 году, когда все это только начиналось. Мы не вышли на митинги, когда Кремль отравил Навального. Мы просто безмолвно наблюдали за этим античеловеческим режимом. И сейчас от нас отвернулся весь мир. И еще 10 поколений наших потомков не отмоются от позора этой братоубийственной войны. Мы, русские люди, думающие и умные. Только в наших силах остановить все это безумие. Выходите на митинги, ничего не бойтесь. Они не могут пересажать нас всех.
Well, in fact, the French president has just been speaking and has said that the French embassy, in Russia, will offer protection to journalists. So we will certainly hear more from Monsieur Macron a little bit later. Meanwhile, Russian prosecutors have asked for the Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny to be moved to a maximum security prison. Russian state media say they are also seeking an additional 13 years in prison for him on charges of fraud and contempt of court. Recent sanctions imposed on Russian oligarchs are based on a list of people compiled by Mr. Navalny. He's already serving a 2.5-year sentence on charges which he says are intended to silence him. Well, don't forget, if you do scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to Sky News' daily podcast, where Jonathan Samuels is joined by our data forensics journalist Jack Taylor to analyse the latest footage coming out of Mariupol, which has been under attack for some 19 days. Well, you can subscribe, of course, to the daily wherever you get your podcasts from. A reminder, too, that we will have a special programme with the latest on the conflict today. At 5 p.m, 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. I'll be live here. And just a heads up as well, coming up at 9 this evening, we'll have a special edition of our business programme, Ian King Live, looking at the impact that the war in Ukraine is having on the global economy. Well, life in Lviv, as you can see, continues here. The Ukrainian flags are here, the main square, there's children. Life goes on in the west, but everybody very mindful after the funerals this morning of those 4 senior officers, how serious the situation is elsewhere in the country, and after that attack also in the west on Sunday. Well, meanwhile, Boris Johnson has underscored his commitment to his drive for energy independence. I'll be discussing that with the former spokesman for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Back in just a moment.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Well, Prime Minister Boris Johnson today has talked about energy independence. He's also talked about the need or the mistakes that were made in Crimea. So let me bring in somebody who was there at the time from the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Michael Bosicue. Good to have you here. So Boris Johnson said we made a terrible mistake back in 2014, not taking action. Would you agree with him in retrospect?
Oh, absolutely. And it's also something the Ukrainians have said for a long time. I think a big mistake was also not putting in a lot of biting sanctions before the Russians invaded, because it was too late once they came in, and I think they're masters at evading that sort of thing. I think you're going to see even more of a bromance with China for them to get past some of these sanctions. So absolutely, I agree.
So how would the world tolerate that? That's been the big question. Certainly we heard from the US State Department last night, none too happy about any cooperation with China. Militarily, they said, economically, or just in general support. So what does the world do about this?
I don't think Mr. Putin would have done what he's doing now without the permission, if you will, or the imprimatur of China. Him and Xi Jinping have, kept tight relationships all the way through COVID as well, when no one was talking to each other. So I don't know how far the Chinese cooperation will go, because don't forget also, they have very big interests here in Ukraine, especially in terms of agriculture, precious minerals, that sort of thing. Ukraine has a lot of what they need. So we may see a similar scenario playing out as we did in Kazakhstan, where China held Russia back to a certain extent. But of course, this all remains to be seen. What do we do about gas and oil then? Obviously, the Prime Minister speaking about the need to look elsewhere for energy. Saudi Arabia, for example, even Iran, Venezuela. These aren't countries necessarily that are better. So what does the world do? well, with all due respect to leaders from the United Kingdom, they've been doing business with dirty money for quite some time, allowing these oligarchs to come to the United Kingdom, buy these big properties with laundered money. But I think, yeah, that's the only way out for the time being, is to go to some of these countries where we don't necessarily have good relations with and get gas and oil from them. And also another step will need to be more so for the United States is allow things like fracking to happen. We're going to have to go back on some of those environmental promises in order to keep energy security.
Yeah, back to the North Sea is the point he's making as well, isn't it? Where do you see this going now? While you were here in Crimea, did you ever see this as the end game? You know, Crimea first, then the rest of Ukraine. Was that a prospect then?
I think we felt that way. When I was with the OSCE at that time, we saw the invasion of the illegal annexation of Crimea, and also we were there when the little green men walked into Donetsk, and that back then there wasn't much opposition pushing them back. But now, of course, the Ukrainian armed forces are much stronger. I'm afraid right now is that with Mr. Putin suffering great losses, they're running out of apparently certain ammunition, is that they're going to resort to their old tactics that they've used elsewhere. Lobbing grad missiles, shelling populated centers into submission. And then the other thing that we see happening right now, of course, is the weaponization of migration. We could see up to a quarter of Ukraine's population, 10 million people, going across borders. Those numbers are trending that way at the moment. So Europe and countries further away, like my own Canada, have to be prepared to really open their hearts to migrants from here.
That's interesting. I mean, that's an enormous refugee crisis. But look around you here. There's children over there blowing bubbles. There's buskers in the square. I mean, some of these people here might be refugees who've settled here. This was a country that was normal, apart from that Russian build-up and then the subsequent invasion and the bombardment that we see now.
Yeah, it's almost a split-screen reality, what we're seeing here at the moment, playing out in Lviv and what's happening in the east and southern parts of Ukraine. But I talked to a lot of people here, and let there be no mistake, there's a lot of anxiety here. Don't forget, this is the birthplace of Ukrainian nationalism. This is where a lot of dissidents who were locked up in the Gulag came from. This is where a lot of the Ukrainian diaspora, including in the United Kingdom, traced their roots back to. So it's very, very important in the Ukrainian psyche, but perhaps even to Mr. Putin to strike at, I'm afraid to say.
Well, one person who knows that too well is the former President, Petra Poroshenko, who I'm going to speak to now. Michael, thank you very much indeed for your time. So let's bring in Petra Poroshenko then. Yet again, another bombardment in Kiev, the city where you are suffering deeply, former President.
First of all, we have a very difficult 20 days, the most difficult in history of our country, maybe one of the most difficult in the history of the world. Only this night, 12 missiles, cruise missiles, was attacking civilian object in Kiev, where we are now. It's happening just a few hundred meters from here, and definitely this is the changes of the Russian tactics. Because if before he wanna keep the cities untouched and make an attempt to move further on Ukrainian territory. When Ukrainian armed forces, which we together created starting from the year 2014, and I'm proud that for the last 8 years, including my presidency, we create one of the strongest and most efficient army in the world. We stopped the Russian army, and Russia paid a huge price by 13,000 Russian soldiers, which were stay here forever, and with the big numbers of the wounded and prisoners of war. And with this situation, I think that we should continue this effective action from Ukrainian army, and for these things we need two additional steps. Point number one, this is the second front. We are not waiting for the NATO troops, NATO soldiers, but we definitely need everything from nutrition to ammunition, from anti-aircraft to anti-tank. And the Ukrainian army should have something to fight with the Russian soldiers. And it seems to me Churchill said before the World War II, if you give me the tools, we do your job. This is exactly the same time, and that would be easy, understandable, mentioning your great prime minister. And point number Two, this is the situation for the Lend-Lease from the all NATO member states. We are ready to pay for that. We are ready to lease that. But please deliver for us not only anti-tank and anti-aircraft, but jet fighters, especially the old Soviet jet fighters, MiG-29, which you don't need. And with that situation, we return the control. We don't need your pilot, but we return the control on the airspace. And that would be the cover for the nuclear power station. That would be the cover for civilian object. And that would be the cover for the Ukrainian troops which protect in Europe. Because you should understand, we fight not only for our soil. We fight for the democracy, for the freedom, and for the West. And Putin is making aggression not against Ukraine. He make an aggression in every single nation of the NATO, of Europe, and the history of the free world is being forged here in Ukraine right now. And with this situation, definitely.
Mr. Poroshenko, but we were at a funeral today of 4 very senior officers, Ukrainian officers, who were killed in the attack, as you know, on the airbase in Yavoriv on Sunday. 4 very senior officers. How many more people are you willing to sacrifice? How many more Ukrainian soldiers, militia, volunteers? You know, will you keep fighting?
Point number 1, exactly on this Yavoriv Center for Security and Peacekeeping. I was with the leaders of United States, Great Britain, and this is the just true in my heart. But this is the question for you. Do you understand that Ukraine do not give up, and Ukraine will fight forever until the victory? But please, we need that would be our own job. And my question, how many died? Just in Yavoriv, this is 37 people were killed by the Russian missiles attack, and this is happening in less than 20 miles from the NATO border. And it was a symbolic attack, because exactly on this Center for Peacekeeping and Security, which was established for the very efficient symbol for the cooperation between Ukraine and NATO, which was opened with my presence, now it was under missiles attack of Russia. And this is the symbol that Putin never stop on Ukraine. Putin go further. And this type of funeral of Ukrainian hero who sacrificed their lives for for the freedom and for the democracy, and more your support, less victim. Very simple arithmetic. And delay with your support means more victim, more blood, more lives of Ukrainian civilians, and more lives of Ukrainian soldiers. And you in Lviv understand what does it mean. You in Lviv understand how we surprise the world by our unity. From the 24th of February, we have now completely different universe. And we also surprise the world with the global unity.
On day 20, when... Yeah, Mr. Poroshenko, we're nearly 3 weeks in, or your country is nearly 3 weeks into this war. Just briefly, if you can, do you have a better idea now than you did at the start what President Putin wants out of this?
Oh. Please, don't trust Putin. Please, don't be afraid of Putin. Because Putin go as far as we together allow them to go. And if we will be strong and united, we stop Putin. If you find out a compromise with Putin, Putin go further. Today, he has a compromise for demanding Ukrainian Crimea or Ukrainian Donbass. Tomorrow, he will demand from the Great Britain, Scotland. Day after tomorrow, he will demand from the United States, Alaska. Putin wants to destroy not only Ukraine, but the whole West, including UK and US. And the earlier we stop him, the more on the eastern flank of the Europe. That would be much cheaper price which world will pay for the peace and security. Don't try to make a compromise with Putin, because that would be Munich in the year 1938. That time, Hitler with the Chamberlain think that they deliver the peace. This is not working. And Putin and Hitler is very, very, very similar position. But believe me, and remember, Ukraine is only the first shot. And we need to be united to stop Putin now in Ukraine. And this is not assistance of Ukraine. This is not help of Ukraine. By the way, the terminal also matter that this is not a conflict, this is the war.
Petra Poroshenko, I apologise for interrupting you. I do need to bring people some breaking news, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. Petra Poroshenko there, former Ukrainian president. Well, let's bring you an update then from Mariupol, and officials say now that 2,000 civilian vehicles have left the besieged port city on an evacuation route. The city council also saying another 2,000 cars are waiting to leave along that humanitarian corridor which runs west for more than 160 miles to the Ukraine-led city of Zaporizhzhia. So that, in a sense, for many people is a breakthrough, trying to get some of those people who are deemed to be starving, short of water, 20 days of bombardment, horrendous living conditions, and certainly all of Ukraine will celebrate if they start to try and get some of those residents out of Mariupol. Well, let's get a broader look then at the situation on the ground. Charlotte Lomas has more from the Sky News Centre. Charlotte.
Yes, hello. Well, it's now day 20 of this war in Ukraine, and let's now have more analysis of what's been going on. I'm joined by our defence and security analyst, Michael Clark. Bring us up to date then, Michael. What's been happening today?
Well, Charlotte, I mean, two areas of interest from a military point of view, in Kiev and in the south, in the push for Odessa.
And if we look in Kiev first, talk me through what's been happening. We know there's been heavy shelling reported.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to have been rocket attacks, which, because the Russians are still a little bit too far away from the centre of Kiev, but this encirclement of the city has taken a lot longer than most of us thought. They are there in the northwest and they're there in the northeast. And we can see from this that the fact that they've lost Hostomel airfield, the Ukrainians, but the fact that they've been fighting in Irpin and Brovary and Bruka is very interesting, because that's just about artillery range for Russian howitzers.
Mm-hmm. And what's the howitzer?
Oh, the howitzers are the tracked artillery. They look like tanks, but they've got a very big gun on. It's a 152mm gun, fires 6 or 8 rounds a minute. If the Russians can get inside these outer areas of Kiev, then they can bring their howitzers in. Old-fashioned technology, they can threaten to pummel the whole city rather than hit them with rockets occasionally, which is what they're doing at the moment. So there'll be a big moment for the Russians, if they're only even on 3 sides of the city, when they can pummel them with old-fashioned artillery. They're having trouble getting through to the south, mainly because the ground. I mean, there's a lot of marshes there. This is the Dnieper River, lots of forested areas. A big force, a heavy force like the Russians have got here, just isn't moving very quickly, and their bridging equipment doesn't seem to be very good. But if they're on 3 sides, they can still threaten to pummel Kiev with their howitzers as and when they get them in place.
OK, then let's take a look a little bit further south then. You mentioned there to Odessa and the advance to Odessa. Describe what's going on here.
The issue is Mykolaiv. It's an important port city. It straddles the delta of the river South Bug. The Russians, again, are finding it really difficult to get over the river. They're not even near it at the moment. And as you can see there, it may be that they've actually got to go north, that they've actually got to push north to cross the river much further north in order to come back to Odessa from that side. But even if they get across the river, even at Mykolaiv, they're still 18 miles from Odessa going westwards. And if they had to come from the north, they're more like 120 or 140 miles. So they've got a long way to go before they can begin to surround Odessa.
Michael Clark, thank you so much for that insight today. 3 weeks almost into this war, and as you heard, there's still so much going on and no sign of any let-up in this fighting.
Charlotte, thank you. Well, our security and defence analyst Michael Clark will be answering your questions on the Ukraine crisis in a live Q&A at 7 p.m. And so to enter a question, do email us at news@sky.com, or you can find us on Twitter at Sky News. So that will be later on. Now, the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, has offered Britain's help to the International Criminal Court to assist in trying to prosecute Russian President Vladimir Putin and his regime for war crimes. Russia has been accused of deliberately firing on civilian areas and using banned weapons to carry out indiscriminate attacks. Sky's Mark Stone has more.
It was a defining image of the war so far. That moment last Wednesday which captured such cruelty. But if there had been some hope then, a sign that she and her baby would be okay, well, it wasn't to be.
While we were resuscitating her and treating her for shock, we carried out a caesarean section and took out her lifeless child. More than 30 minutes of resuscitation didn't produce any results. Then more than 30 minutes of resuscitation of the mother didn't produce any results. Both died.
In the same city over the past 24 hours...
Well, apologies, we're going to head straight to the United Nations and Russia's ambassador there, Vasily Nebenzia.
At the very start, we said that there are paragraphs in the resolution which are not humanitarian, and they should not be in the resolution of the humanitarian situation. Yesterday, under the title of breaking news, we learned that the French and Mexican ambassadors came to you and announced that instead of the Security Council, they will move this resolution to the General Assembly, which is not standard practice, as you all know, but they were citing the inability to adopt this resolution in the Council because of Russia. As I said, we made it clear that we would be prepared to adopt a humanitarian resolution. So I think that the chances are still there, and that's why we will put forward our own draft, which is humanitarian, and we will put it into the blue shortly, and we'll see whether the Security Council can or cannot fulfill its mission to adopt a resolution which will be on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine with clear humanitarian provision like call for negotiated ceasefire, evacuation of civilians, respect of international humanitarian and human rights law, condemnation of attacks against civilians and civilian objects, safe and unhindered passage, unhindered access of humanitarian assistance, etc. So I wanted to advise you in advance before we came forward, and as I said, will be shortly.
Ambassador, will you take questions, sir? Thank you. Thank you, sir. Eric Shawn, Fox News. Ambassador, when will Vladimir Putin stop his war crimes? When will you stop this obscene assault against Ukraine? And will Vladimir Putin surrender?
And what?
Will Vladimir Putin surrender?
I heard the first part. And what's surrender what?
Surrender your assault and barbaric war against Ukraine. Will you stop in the sake of humanity?
When the goals of the special military operations are achieved, it will stop. It was announced from the very beginning. I must tell you that I appreciate your humane approach, but I didn't see that humane approach. In all these 8 years, when Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian armed forces and radicals were shelling and bombing Donetsk and Lugansk without any reproach, basically any reproach from the international community, from the no comments from the UN officials on that issue. Yesterday, there was a barbaric attack of the Ukrainian armed forces who used cluster munitions in which Russia is accused based on sources which cannot be identified. But they used the cluster munition in the center of Donetsk. 21 persons died. 30 plus wounded. No comments. I was looking through news, including Western media today. I didn't come across a single article on that barbaric attack. Yesterday, Secretary General made a stakeout. He didn't say a word on that attack. Only when asked a question, he said that if that was deliberate, it is condemnable. I must tell you that we are very much concerned how UN officials, including the top ones, including the Secretary General, including Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, are assessing the situation in Ukraine, accusing Russia of indiscriminate attacks. Secretary General yesterday said that although that attack is condemnable, the most of the destruction comes from the Russian sources, as if he was comparing two events and implying that that attack didn't deserve condemnation.
Ambassador, it's Pamela Falk from CBS News, as you know. My question is about a ceasefire. What would it take for Russia to have an overall, not just humanitarian ceasefire? What does Ukraine need to do? And what's in your resolution? What are you proposing on humanitarian corridors? Thank you.
I cited a few things obvious for a humanitarian resolution. You will see it soon, shortly, because it will be published.
For an overall ceasefire.
Negotiated ceasefire. Of course, it should be negotiated, and the ceasefire will take place when conditions that were put forward by Russia will be implemented, and they are very well known.
And could you just lay it out what those conditions are?
Demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, no threat which would come from that territory, from that country to Russia, no joining NATO. President Zelenskyy announced just a few hours perhaps ago that he understands that Ukraine will not join NATO, citing in particular his disappointment with the way NATO reacted, but the goal of Ukraine joining NATO is in the Ukrainian constitution, so it should be dropped from there first and foremost. I think that's enough.
Question, Ambassador, on the parallels we hear, sir, between the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. You've been very critical. Russia has been very critical. You've also been very critical of the 2011 invasion attack on Libya led by NATO. Are there parallels between what the US did in 2003 and the unilateral actions we are seeing from Russia and the criticism that is being leveled against UN officials that are simply seeking to defend the UN Charter?
Every situation is unique, but I do not recall the level of outrage, hysterics that US invasion of Iraq.
They tried to get Kofi Annan fired.
Sorry?
They tried to get Kofi Annan fired, so I would argue there were...
No resolutions, nothing, if you remember. No resolution of the Security Council, nothing that would be comparable to what we're experiencing today. Thank you very much.
Again, I really can't hear you with your mask on. Yes. Well, there then is the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, asked at the start of that, will you stop this war for the sake of humanity? And once again saying we will stop when the demilitarization has happened, pointing out, as he put it, that the area of Donbass had been shelled by Ukraine for 8 long years with no reproach from Western leaders then. So the words there of Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the UN. Just bringing some breaking news now. We're talking about humanitarian corridors concerning Mariupol earlier. The Red Cross says that 70 buses are ready now in Sumy in the northeast to evacuate civilians assembling for an operation that it hopes to start today. So we'll certainly monitor that for you. So after those 2,000 vehicles from Mariupol and now Sumy, so fingers crossed for them. Now, Chelsea Football Club has announced that it will not be able to sell tickets for Saturday's FA Cup tie at Middlesbrough. As a result, the club is asking the FA for the game to be played behind closed doors. Part of the fallout, of course, from sanctions on the Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich. He's among 7 Russian billionaires added to a British sanctions list last week. Today, the government announcing sanctions against a further 370 Russian and Belarusian individuals and entities. Mr. Abramovich thought to have travelled to Moscow in the last 24 hours. And tracking him is our correspondent Jason Farrell.
Yeah, well, he was photographed in Tel Aviv airport where he'd visited Israel Sunday night, and he was photographed on Monday. Got a flight here to Istanbul, but didn't stay for very long, left in the early hours this morning. And it's not clear exactly why he made that trip to Israel or indeed here to Istanbul. There's speculation a Muhsen Bayrak, a businessman here in Turkey, had expressed an interest in buying Chelsea, and he claims to have met Abramovich last week and has set up another meeting with him later in this week. However, of course, Chelsea is no longer Abramovich's to sell. It doesn't mean he couldn't get involved in the sale, but he cannot benefit from the sale. That's what the government has said, that would be the terms of their license to Chelsea. If they wanted to sell it, it had to be clear that Abramovich could not benefit from the sale because he is sanctioned. Not only Abramovich coming here, but his super yacht Solaris, which had been actually been in Barcelona 4 days ago, seems to be now heading down here. He's got 2 super yachts, one also off the coast of North Africa. I have to say, if it had remained in Barcelona, it might well have been seized by the EU, because he's also been added today to the EU sanction list. We now know that Abramovich is back in Moscow, having left here in the early hours. So his ability to travel, spend money, is being tightened as these sanctions tighten on him.
Jason, thank you very much indeed. So day 20 then of Russia's invasion, humanitarian corridors we've talked about. We'll keep you posted on that throughout the afternoon. But here, trying to keep a sense of normality for the young children of Lviv, despite the funeral service attended by so many this morning. But here, as you can see, the children of Lviv being entertained. They're trying to keep, at least in western parts of Ukraine, these children protected from the war. More, of course, throughout the afternoon.